Hello everybody and welcome to this seminar on how natural capital is or could be used by policymaking. I'm Kerry Waylen, speaking from the James Hutton Institute in Aberdeen, and it's my pleasure to be chairing this discussion today. We've got two excellent speakers. We have Simone Martino. Dr. Simone Martino is also from the James Hutton Institute, and Professor Ian Bateman. So we'll come to proper introductions later, but first just a few words of housekeeping from me. I've got that fun job. So this, in case you're not familiar with the Natural Capital Initiative, it's a partnership between the Royal Society of Biology, the James Hutton Institute, and the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology, or CEH. And the NCI mission is to support decision-making that results from the sustainable management of our natural capital. So this session, as the name suggests, is focused on policy and if and how different areas of policy are influenced and shaped by natural capital. So nature obviously plays a pivotal role in almost all aspects of our life and certainly is relevant to many policies. So we need to improve the way in which policymaking, as well as other sectors, can help take nature into account. So I should advise you that this event is being recorded and it will be available on the FRSB YouTube channel after this event. So we have the ability later on for you to ask questions and to unmute yourself and participate. But remember, if you do that, you then, of course, will form part of that recording. You are welcome to leave questions as the speakers are going using the chat function. And we also invite you to unmute yourselves and ask directly afterwards if you prefer. We won't be taking questions after either of the speakers as they go one by one. We'll deal with them all afterwards. So I think that's probably all of the housekeeping to get through. So now I'm going to turn to introducing Simone. So Simone is a colleague of mine at the James Hutton Institute, and he does all sorts of things related to natural capital. He's an environmental economist doing work that ranges from how farmer collaboratives can work with natural capital as well as other capitals, through to working with natural capital in marine and coastal systems. I'm probably going to fail to introduce either of my speakers adequately. So of course, please do feel free to introduce yourselves more fully if you so wish. And both of the speakers are going to speak for 15 to 20 minutes. But first of all, Simone's up, and he's going to be telling us something about an international review that he's been leading, exploring where across the world natural capital has been used in policymaking and something of the consequences. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Simone to share his slides. And I encourage you, all of you, as the speakers are speaking, to keep thinking of any questions you have for them or comments for the discussion and leave them in the chat if you so wish. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Kerry. Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for the presentation. No, there is no need to add to my profile, and thanks Natural Capital Initiative for this invite. Now I try to share my screen, and always it can be the most difficult part of the job sometimes. Let me see if you see. Oh, maybe not yet. Is it in full mode screen?
That's perfect. Okay, over
fantastic.
To you.
Thanks a lot. Thanks, everyone. I'm going to talk about how natural capital is used in policymaking. So we carried out a research recently to explore this specific aspect. In particular, what we did is under the Scottish Government Strategic Research Programme. So, and under in particular the project Galvanizing Change via Natural Capital, led by our chair today, Kerry Waylen, we explore the extent to which natural capital can be used as a lever to advance policy formulation. So we think that natural capital as a concept can shape the environmental governance and can be used to allocate funds better. But we want to explore more this concept. We have some ideas on how ecosystem services are used and how this is linked in particular to spatial planning. We don't have much information about natural capital. There are some recent papers produced, and they have not found much evidence in terms of influence of natural capital in policymaking. So just let me, that was a kind of introduction, and to go one slide back, just to show you that As an outline, I'm going to propose some objectives of this talk, and then the methods used, some key results focusing on some key elements, and some final considerations. So what we're planning to do today is to propose some international cases of natural capital being used at national level, but also at subnational level, I would say local or regional scale. But we are not considering the supranational level, so what happens at the European scale. Some of the policy key objectives of this research that I want to discuss today are reported here in these green boxes. So we're going to explore the range of geographic location where natural capital is used, the policy domain which are related to natural capital, some tools and approaches that are used in policymaking when implementing natural capital, and finally we try to distill some impact, to what extent natural capital is able to influence at a certain way policymaking. In terms of methods and search, what we did is a literature review. And we started with a scoping review, just Googling some key term in Google, adding, for instance, spaces and time, regions, key policies, etc., in order to see what could find. And finally, according to the results of the scoping review, we wrote a protocol in order to identify better our case studies. The keywords that we decided to use in this research, in our search, are natural capital, ecosystem services, and in policy. And in particular, we search under Google Scholar and Web of Science. We found many papers, but also we found that not many of them are strictly related to our objectives. And so in this case, we decided to do another purposeful search, in particular exploring what there is in some web pages provided by IPBS, OECD, World Bank, PBL, UN, and many others, and consider many reports and several citations of these reports. So we started with an initial database of 4,000 studies that, using some exclusion criteria, we reduced to a little bit more than 300. And finally, screening more these case studies, we distilled 168 final case studies. So we consider at the end 69 academic papers and 99 reports. So in particular, what we did during the screening phase was to consider mainly the cases that provide an idea that the natural capital accounts or other topologies, other approaches are used in policy and can be influence policymaking. In terms of coding, we have several variables that we decide to code. Here I provide some of the few that I try to discuss today. In particular, we decided to explore the geography of the approach, the policy domain, some categories or processes that are used in policymaking, such as plans, regulations, strategies, frameworks, and finally, the tools that are used to operationalize natural capital in policymaking. And finally, we try also to say something about the influence. How can we describe influence or impact? So just briefly, let me show you this starting graph that shows the natural capital accounts that were reported in our case. So this picture reports more or less 30 countries. And these countries, of course, are just a limited number of countries compared to the ones that are considered by United Nations. So the United Nations says that more than 100 countries are producing natural capital accounts. In our case, we have more or less 1/3, but at least we know that these studies refer to the use of natural capital in policies. You can also see a different palette of colors from red to blue, dark blue, which refer to the number of natural capital accounts that we found. So it seems surprising that we found more accounts in the Global South, but probably this happened because we used many of the reports, many of the studies produced by World Bank and the United Nations in general, WWF, that are assisting countries in the global south in order to mainstream natural capital in policies. Of course, as you can see in the global north, there are countries such as the United Kingdom, the Netherlands, Sweden, Spain, and France that are also quite a leader in this area. The next slide is about the typologies of natural capital accounts that we found. And in particular, what we found is that the account that is mainly considered in these countries is water. And also we have to add accounts related to forest and to biodiversity, energy, and in general terms, carbon emissions or carbon sequestrations. We have found that mainly countries in the global south are considering natural capital accounts of natural resources such as water, while or forest, while countries in the global north are mainly focusing on marine resources, biodiversity, and ecosystems, services, and ecosystem accounts in general terms. Yes, this is the slide that I was commenting. In particular, this is the number of countries in percentage that are producing accounts. So 70% of the countries are producing water accounts, so more or less 2/3. But there are at least 20–30% of the countries that are producing at least one account. A few thematic accounts are not very well considered, in particular air emissions and landscape. But as I mentioned before, others related to forest or to water, timber, etc., are particularly used in the global south. We have not considered only natural capital accounts, but in general terms, other types of approaches. And in particular, we were focusing on the way in which natural capital can be mainstreamed in policy. And it's possible to find a long list of approaches used. Here, this is just a brief overview with some countries in the global south and the global north. You can see the possibility to produce indicators such as the genuine progress indicators or the implementation of a macroeconomic model to simulate policy scenarios, but also implementation of participatory approaches using GIS mapping that are very common here in England and the UK in order to mainstream natural capital at a very local scale. In terms of policy domains, it's not a surprise that domains that are mainly that we found more frequently are those related to the natural capital accounts that I mentioned before. On the left-hand side, you can see a list of accounts in order of importance according to the list that I showed you before. And in the pie chart, you can see the most important policy, in particular water, forest, climate change, and biodiversity. It is quite important that there are some transversal policies that refer to the formulation of national regional development plans. And also there are other policies that refer to the formulation and implementation of environmental taxes, environmental expenditures, formulation of indicators such as well-being, and these are quite well produced in several countries. So we found in China, in the US, in France. As regards the implementations of these approaches, and we explore what happens under the area of natural capital, and we include also ecosystem services, we find that 60% of our case studies refer to the implementation of a specific plan. This can be a plan of a single resource, a plan for managing water or forest, or a plan which is more general and more overarching more natural capital or ecosystem services, for instance, referring to the national development plan of a country. And also there are many policies that refer to these approaches, and they are addressing the problem of sustaining the green growth or the sustainable development goal or achieving poverty reduction goals, etc. Specific ways of implementing natural capital and ecosystem services are provided by other tools that are reported here in this chord diagram. So you can see the implementation of taxes, the formulation of new regulations, and also the implementation of environmental markets and payments for ecosystem services. I provided here just a brief snapshot of what we found and what we better reported in our report, in the final report of this research. And you can see examples of these tools available in globally overall, from the global south to the global north. A brief ideas about how we may classify the impacts of this research. We started from a paper provided by Zoliomi, and we rearranged a little bit that classifications, and we modified in these 5 categories from conceptual to instrumental, where conceptual is a change in knowledge, and instrumental means that there is a direct change in decision making. And in between, we have an information of our policy through knowledge exchange, the improvement of skills and training, in many cases provided by, for instance, the United Nations and World Bank to many countries in the global south. One common thing that we found is participation, stakeholder involvement. We try to give one of these 2 attributes, each of these impact to each of these case studies that we selected in our research. And more or less, we can say that 60% of our case studies can be conceptual or instrumental in terms of impact. However, it's never easy to attribute this specific impact to any specific case studies, because probably when we end up with an instrumental impact, there is a background of any other impacts that are related to participations or knowledge exchange. And in fact, just to make an example, if you look at the narrative that is provided in the bottom part of this slide, so in the second row of these slides, which is related to the management of water in Botswana, it's clear, it's evident the use of natural capital accounting for the formulation of several plans, the National Special Plan and the National Water Plan. But at the same time, it's clear from the narrative the establishment of good links among several stakeholders, in particular at the horizontal scale, between several ministries, the offices of statistics, and this is quite a relevant dimension that we found in many studies. I would say more horizontal link between in our studies than vertical link in the environmental governance. Let me say a couple of words, couple of final considerations, which are related mainly to the negative aspects of our findings. So far, what we found is quite positive. So it's quite a positive picture on how natural capital and also ecosystem services is used in several policy domains internationally. But there are case studies that report limited political support, in particular the lack of legal mandate. This is the case of Finland, for instance. And also, we also found that the policy domains that refer to natural capital are limited. In our case studies, we found 18 main policy domains, but environmental governance is much broader. And in particular, there is the built or non-environmental governance that is not much affected by natural capital. So another idea that was quite interesting in terms of weakness that we found is the limited link between natural capital and policy objectives. So in particular here, probably the use of modeling of scenario analysis can be quite interesting in this case. And the final one, I would say, consideration that I would like to say here in terms of limits of our finding is that we are not able from these case studies to address the dynamic of the policy process. So to what extent natural capital is able to provide insight into the changes that happens in the governance. So the shape and the changes in the governance mechanisms. I would say this is also consideration that is made by Primer et al. In a recent paper published in Ecosystem Services journal, and probably this type of difficulties can be implemented through a primary approach, through engaging directly with a transdisciplinary team of academics and people participating to the policy process, to the science policy interface. I would say that this is my very last slides. Hopefully I have not used too much time, considering that I lost a little bit of time because of technical problems. And I would say that I can hand over to our chair, and I stop sharing now.
Thank you very much, Simone. The technical problems did not derail you, so congratulations on that extra hurdle. And thanks for that insight. So what we have there is a kind of broad brush overview of what's happening across the world. And Simone mentioned a report which already exists. I believe he's working on a paper, and the data will be shared in future. So if you'd like to know more, then please do. You can always find out more afterwards, as well as asking questions during this discussion. So now at this point, we're going to switch to Ian, which feels a bit rude because I'm sure there's lots that people would like to ask you, Simone, but we can come back to that later. So Professor Ian Bateman probably is known to many of you. He's Professor of Environmental Economics at Exeter in the Land, Environment, Economics and Policy Institute. He's done lots of things. He's been a member of the Natural Capital Committee, member of the DEFRA Science Advisory Council. I just found out that you've been advising our First Minister up here in Scotland, is that right? Yeah. You've got connections with New Zealand and Australia. So there's sort of very few people better qualified to talk about environmental economics and natural capital's connection with policy making. So I understand what we're going to get now is quite a contrast to what you've just heard from Simone. We're now going to focus digging down more into what natural capital is and how it can work in the UK context. So over to you, Ian. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much. And thank you for the invitation to come and talk to you all. Greatly appreciate. I just want to check that you can see my screen. Can you?
Yes, it's beautiful.
Lovely. Okay, that's great. So I'm going to crack straight into it. So I want to start just with a quick overview of how natural capital thinking has already influenced UK environment and agricultural policy. And then the rest of the talk, I want to talk about how things could be taken further and perhaps improved going forward. So very quick overview of a range of policy and policy-related documents which have brought the natural capital approach into decision-making within the UK. Going right the way back to the UK National Ecosystem Assessment a long time ago now, and its influence upon the then white paper, its then acceptance across different parties, the setting up of the Natural Capital Committee, and then the fruit of that work beginning to appear from about 2018 right up to the present day. I want to highlight a couple of documents that I think are particularly important. The 25-year Environment Plan was the first time that the government actually put its hat in the ring and said that it was going to adopt a natural capital approach. I personally think even more important, the influence of natural capital thinking upon the Treasury Green Book. This is the document that sets out the rules for assessing public spending proposals, and it includes some very interesting rules now with regard to the incorporation of natural capital, both in terms of its stocks and also in terms of the flows of value that natural capital can provide. So what is this natural capital approach to decision making? First of all, I do want to stress terminologies change. So natural capital is the present way that we try and explain the relationships between environment and economy. Now, that terminology may well change, and I wouldn't have a problem with that, really. What will endure, perhaps sadly, is the connections between the environment and the economy and the negative feedbacks that we get in particular upon the natural world from our economic activities. So the natural capital approach is attempting to bring those real world connections into economic policy and also business decision making. It's trying to make the model of the world that a decision maker has closer to the real world. That's really all it's about, so that we try and get decisions which take into account those connections and the consequences of change. I do want to stress it is an attempt to try and make better decisions, not perfect decisions. We don't have time for trying to make perfect decisions, but we do have to make better decisions than the ones that we've made at the moment. Okay, so what is this natural capital framework? If you want to find out more, I was incredibly lucky to spend a number of years working with Georgina Mace, who I'm sure will be familiar to many of you, before sadly she passed away just a few years ago. And this paper will give you quite a lot more information about that. Although actually what I'm presenting today is a bit of an update from that. Okay, so we have capital stocks. And I want to stress that it's not just natural capital. You know, if you were talking to 99% of decision makers and you were talking about capital, they wouldn't be thinking about natural capital. They'd be thinking about manufactured capital, buildings, factories, machines, that sort of stuff, or maybe human capital, the intellect and population available. All of these capital stocks provide flows. If we think about natural capital, you can think about the difference between, say, a population of fish being the stock and the catch of fish being the flow that we take out of that. Whether or not it's sustainable, I'll come on to that. And those different flows are what get combine together in productive processes and produce everything that we need. Some of those goods and services are provided direct by the environment, but actually that's actually a minority. Most goods and services that we depend on are provided with some mix of those various flows there. There's backwards flows, keeping things renewed, but most decisions are made in terms of the values that we get out of those goods. So there's the private values, often being the ones that determine investments, but there's also the public values. And some of those we can put money values on, and some of them I don't think we can. Again, I'll come on to that. The criterion should be, does putting a monetary value on something improve or actually hold back the quality of decision being made? It shouldn't be made on dogma. And from that, we get well-being. And that well-being is distributed in a very often unfair way across society. So you can see that we've got a physical world and we've got a values and well-being world. Another way of looking at this, you can see that as you go from the left to the right, that's the supply of resources and goods, and right to left gives you the demand for resources and goods. And both of those are really important. You can't look at what's going on from just one perspective. Okay, very important information that you get on this, because we want to use this to actually make better decisions. And the first is, it tells us about whether what we're doing is sustainable or not. If we are running down the stocks of capital to levels below which there is a chance that they will actually collapse, and the inputs flows that they provide will stop or be impaired, then that's not sustainable. Now that rule actually applies to all three types of capital, but it's the natural capital that we're pushing to the edge. Second, efficiency. The conversion of flows to value, in essence, is efficiency. We want to use the resources that the earth has bestowed upon us as carefully as possible. What does that actually mean? Well, and certainly a decision maker might say, well, it's trying to produce as much well-being as possible out of that. So efficiency sounds horribly economic, but actually it should be your friend. You ought to cuddle up to efficiency and welcome it in. And finally, it tells us, this structure tells us about equity. It tells us about who is getting that well-being and the extent to which society is being fostered by that. Okay, decisions are made. What you've got today, it all looks very, you know, it flows through, but it doesn't look like it actually goes anywhere afterwards. Well, that's not the case, because we are making decisions all the time. We are looking at different options, we're appraising them, we're comparing them, we're making decisions. At least we should be doing all of those things. Now, we need a little bit more space here, so I'm going to extend that down. And first of all, just want to put out there, this system applies to business as well as to policy. So policy decisions go around and they affect those stocks, the flows, and the goods and services that are produced. But this seminar is mainly on policy, and we can see that there are three types of policy. There's equity policy, thinking about maybe redistributional taxes, income support. There's efficiency policy, trying to regulate what economists will call the externalities, if you like, the pollution outflows, that sort of thing that this system creates. And finally, there's sustainability policy, the need to make sure that stock of capital actually is sufficient to move across generations and maintain the opportunities for well-being into the future. And that gives us this decision and policy world as well. So that's what the natural capital framework actually is. And I think it's really interesting that this has actually now made really deep inroads into the ways in which policy is made, and increasingly has impact upon business decisions as well. But there is a but. These connections are complex. They are really complex. And we need to try and bring this into decision making. Unfortunately, this often isn't what happens. What happens usually is that because the world's complex, we just focus on a subset of it. This means that we don't know what the full consequences of our decisions actually are. And the natural capital system is attempting to capture these system connections. Okay, I want to give an example to do with afforestation. And here's an analysis of afforestation. Of course, we're thinking about planting large areas of the UK with trees to try and soak up carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. And these are the sort of things that will often be considered, you know, which species, how's it going to fix carbon into the future, maybe how's it going to affect the soil carbon, maybe we might consider, oh, we've got to manage this, we can manage it for lots of things, we can manage it for carbon, manage it for timber. Might even go as far as think, oh, well, what's that carbon going to do once we cut the tree down? Is it going to go straight back into the atmosphere or not? But actually, this is just a subset of what's really happening out there. Because when we plant trees, certainly in a country like the UK, we're planting it on land that is already in use. So we might, for example, be pushing agriculture out of the way. Now, you might think, well, that's great because agriculture is the source of many problems, but it's not so great if it means that we now start just importing our food from places like Amazonia. If we end up felling 2 trees in Amazonia for each tree we plant in the UK, that's not a very good deal for the planet. There's impacts elsewhere. There's impacts on the water environment, on biodiversity, on recreation, health. There is a multitude of land use options, and we need to consider them and all of their system effects for us to actually make better decisions. Otherwise, planting trees might turn out to be a bad idea. It's perfectly feasible to actually make things worse by planting trees if you don't take into account these other effects. So, what our focus has been for quite a long time now is to try and create tools to support these sorts of decisions. And I want to just present you with a couple, and then I'll finish. So first of all, we need to bring better physical science into decision making. And I want to illustrate this with a little film that I've got here. Here we go. I think you want to hear that. So here we've got a tool that we've created. Some of you will be familiar with the Joules model. Really good ecological model. What we've done is we've taken it, we've sped it up. We've actually run it thousands of times and done something called emulation, which makes it move really, really fast. This allows us to find out what the consequences of planting trees on different parts of the country actually would be. So here's one here. We've put trees over the country, and you can see what's going to happen to the carbon that tree stores over time. And if we just move to another area, that illustrates the fact that there's uncertainty associated with that. Here we've gone from one quite uncertain place to another place that is less uncertain. This speeding up allows you to do things like change climate change scenarios and their assemblages, which has huge impacts upon the carbon storage into the future. Another thing that this illustrates is that doing the same thing in different places has colossally different effects. So planting trees down perhaps in East Anglia stores an awful lot less carbon than planting it in some of the more productive areas of the UK. Something that, of course, a decision maker's got to be interested in, because they're never going to have an infinite amount of money to play with. Okay, I have to show this next bit because the AI people just absolutely love it, and we can speed this up so that we can do 21 years of calculations in roughly the time that you can see there. So this this introduction of techniques to allow very fast computation allows you to bring these tools, which normally brilliant tools, but they're so slow they do not get used by policymakers. You can actually now bring them into decision making. Okay. And what we've got to now is a point where we actually have co-design of decision tools by users using AI techniques to drive self-assembly. What on earth does all that mean? Let me give you another film. Sorry. Hopefully this will work. Yeah, it does. Yeah, that's great. Okay, so another film. Here you've got one of our quite recent tools. Works for anywhere in the UK, and it basically allows the decision maker themselves to self-build their own tool, looking at the things that they're interested in rather than the things that we as scientists think that they ought to be interested in. I'll just speed this up because it's quite a long, so you can zoom right in. Sorry, I did that a bit fast. And you can look at any area you want, and you can define the areas that you're interested in. Okay, interested in there. You can get really close. Now, here's the quite cool bit. Now you can actually begin to get the decision system to make a tool for you. Sorry, it's still going through selecting the areas. Here we go. Right. Okay. So here the decision maker is saying, I'm interested in carbon. I can set the measures that I'm interested in, the years that I'm interested in. I'm also interested in biodiversity. I want to look at mammals. I'm happy with the metrics that are used. I'm happy with the years that I want to look at. And here they're selecting a specific species that they are particularly intrigued about, the grey dagger, which I'm told is a moth. Okay, and they have now constructed their own tool. Now you can see the difference is that we've still got the area that you saw before, but now what you've got is a whole set of sliders that allow you to change the things that you're interested in. So you can add more or less carbon, more or less here mammals. Oh, you can't have any of those grey daggers because they don't live in this area. You can change the amount of area that you plant, the amount of recreation, and there are others that are coming soon. The most obvious one, of course, which is money. How much money is this actually going to cost me? You can allow the system to tell you what is the best use of the land that you've got, given the outcomes that you want. Or you can specify, whatever happens, I want to use those areas in red there. And the system will then give you different options, each of which will tell you the amount of carbon, various things to do with biodiversity, the area planted. In this case, we're also interested in visitors, and allow you to choose which of these different land use strategies appeals to you the most. Right, I'll just finish up by giving one last example. So a quick case in terms of UK afforestation. So where should we plant Britain's new forests? If we do it the usual way, we will take a lot of money and throw it on the table and in effect leave it to the market to decide where those forests are going to be planted, because farmers are going to look at those subsidies and look at what they're going to be giving up, which is mainly agricultural values, and that will be how the decision to plant is taken. And we'd expect, if that's the case, that you'd get planting on some of the most marginal lands in the UK. Unfortunately, they're marginal because they have very poor soils, they're very exposed, that sort of stuff. And this means that the trees won't grow very well there either. So although you've spent a lot of money, you're not going to get much in terms of carbon and other benefits from this. Alternatively, you can use these tools, use this natural capital approach, which is now within the Green Book, and you can consider all of the variety of benefits and costs that are incurred when you change land use. Many of those you can value. Some of them we don't believe that you can robustly value, but you can bring them in with firm constraints, for example, demanding that this scheme creates no loss for biodiversity. And if you do that, you plant in very different areas. I don't don't know if you saw that. There you go. And generate much better value for money for the UK taxpayer. Okay, that's a whistle-top tour of what I wanted to talk about, and I'll pass back to the studio, as they say.
Thank you very much, Ian. And hopefully you can stop sharing. Well, thank you so much. So I am slightly scarred by the phrase cuddle up to efficiency. Perhaps as a social scientist, I just need to go over that. But thanks for some interesting insights there, and the ideas about equity, efficiency and sustainability policy were new to me in terms of useful to think about. So overall, I guess, hearing both those talks, I've got the sense that some progress is being made in working with natural capital and policy. This framing is perhaps a useful one, so that, and business making, but we need to be careful and need not to avoid this trap of sort of somehow reducing it down to some single issue thing to make it more manageable, which of course is a big challenge. And Ian's given us some great examples of tools that may help. And it might also be useful to distinguish between different types of policy. So I think Simone's talk pointed out like there's some unevenness in the kind of areas it tends to be associated with. Water seems to be very popular, maybe less so, I don't know, trade and transport. And then also maybe types of policy instrument. So lots of things to think about there. I think we've got a couple of questions in the chat so far, but I thought I might abuse my position by kicking off the discussion by asking one question, and then we'll turn back to those questions in the chat. So, and also I should say to people, if you'd like to ask a question verbally, do put your hand up if you've got that available to you, or maybe send a heart emoji, whatever seems to work. So my question is, it's just one question, but it's a bit of a tricky one. So if you had a magic wand, what would you change in order to make sure that policymakers were embedded in reflecting and working with natural capital?
Yeah. Simone, do you want to?
Yes, I can go. Thanks, Ian. Thanks for the interesting talk. Well, I personally do not work specifically, at the with the policymakers. So I've been working in the past mainly with some economic evaluation, not always linked to the impact on policy. I would say that one of the difficulty is to have in this concept not only natural capital or ecosystem services or the ecosystem approach per se as an umbrella that may be more comprehensive. The difficulty of incorporating these ideas, this concept into the non-environmental governance. So I would say that we found in our research 18 key policy areas that consider natural capital and ecosystem services, but this is just one part of the environmental governance and doesn't include, as you mentioned before, Kerry, transport or defense or many other areas. Health sometimes is included, but because there is a connection between health, well-being, and nature. But I would say, so a magic wand should be used to transfer these approaches from the environmental governance to the non-built environment, to the non-environmental area. So that would, I don't know how is it possible, but magically probably, yes. This is what I would say I would do.
Okay, Ian, over to you.
Well, my one doesn't have to be particularly magical, actually. You could probably just make this out of common garden timber, really. Just use the information that's already available. If decision makers use the information, if they actually were prepared to go with the science, and I mean all types of science, natural, physical, economic, social, that would be a revolution. That would just be a huge step forward. There's a lot of historical reasons why they don't, and why they would love to be able to say that they're following the evidence and not actually change. But if they just use the evidence available, we would, for example, have your average farmer better off than they are now. Average farmer, not your very rich farmer, The average farmer would be better off. You would have no drop in food security. You would have a big improvement in carbon with regard to land, and you would have a massive, in proportional terms, improvement in biodiversity if we just use the information that's already there. The reasons why that doesn't happen, well, you might want to go and talk not just to politicians, but to the NFU and ask why they don't support this, because it would actually make farmers better off.
Yes, so often a lack of evidence or insufficient information or uncertainty is used as an excuse or an easily pointed to justification for resisting change. And I think in general, a lot of us, even with the ignoring vested interests, are generally reluctant and struggle with change and newness. So we tend to cling on to existing ways of working and the existing ways in which resources flow or things are designed. But ultimately, we need to take a look at ourselves and not kind of use excuses, I guess, is part of that. I think at this point, I should stop abusing my prerogative and look at the questions in the chat. So we have a question back from when Simone was talking, but Simone, you should answer first, but Ian, I'm sure you'd have comments as well, which is from Laura, how can natural capital accounting take into consideration the value that native or indigenous people place on the land? Were any examples of this are found in your study, Simone? And I guess within the UK context, we probably wouldn't use the language of indigenous people, but sort of local people's values perhaps would also be relevant.
Yes, thanks for the question. It's very interesting. I read in the chat before, I was thinking about trying to remember as many case studies as possible in order to answer this question. And there was not much about the values of indigenous people into the natural capital and in policy. What I found was mainly national policy, operationalized possibly through accounts. So these accounts, as I try to show, refer to some key resources, for instance, water, forest, timber. Of course, the management of these resources affect the indigenous people, but this link was not emphasized in the studies that we found. I don't know. This is just referring to to our specific studies. To the question if natural capital can be used to manage specifically these values. Yeah, probably we can do at a very local scale. We have to use approaches that incorporate the participations of local stakeholders into these studies. Ian showed different tools. One that was operating at national level, another one was showing something, how values changed if you manage land locally in a different way. So incorporating, I would say, local, the views and the voice of local people in the participatory approach at a local scale, probably we can take into account of these voices. I stop here.
Okay, I am probably going to really get myself into trouble now, but this is what I think, so fair enough. I have great concern about the presumption that local is better. I think local decision-making often just turns out to be a reinforcement of local power disparities. You know, I've got an example that I'm involved in here, just to make it really personal. One person, one powerful person, is stopping two towns being linked by cycleways because they can, and they are local. And you know, I think sometimes we do need dispassionate, non-local decision making to actually do what is best for society. Local is not necessarily better than not local. If I can make a real political point, look at what has happened to this country now that we have taken back control. You know, has that worked? You know, what a great step forward that was. So I don't know that local is necessarily better. I think trying to address the fact that people have very, very different levels of power is something that I would want to put at the front of that. I've done a lot of focus groups, and I've seen a lot of people about my age and about my gender controlling those focus groups in ways that I didn't think very much of.
Yeah, so it's really important not to romanticize local or community, but equally, to try and, I guess this also relates to the fact that there are trade-offs and tensions, and no tool or evidence or data is going to make those go away. That sometimes what a local group want or is in their interests is not actually the same as what national level priorities might suggest. And there is no, clear right or wrong there. Only that we need to try and think about both. Yes. I would say local authorities are often a missing player in this, because they are sort of charged with making some of these top-down, bottom-up connections, although often perhaps lack the capacity to do so.
Yes.
Before I start ranting as well, I think before we burn down the Zoom, I see a question from Mac about the influence of subjectors' aesthetic values on decision making, and he says, or she, or they, sorry, my PhD research at the University of Cumbria reveals that professional conservationists in leadership roles in different organisations value aesthetically very different forms of natural capital, and thus the associated land use regimes. And Max says only 1 out of 23 said they valued aesthetically bogs and wetlands. Yes. So, I don't know if this sort of blurs a little bit with this issue of the kind of subjective local relations. If and how should we factor that in? Or do we simply just go, yes, Mac, that happens?
Do you want to go, Simone?
Well, it's difficult to answer. I try to link the question to the case studies. And in that specific case, the thematic analysis of natural capital accounts related to landscape, I would say we have not coded anything about aesthetic values, but about landscapes, was very minor, was one of the least mentioned in our studies. So I would say that globally, at least in these case studies, which refer to the global implementation of natural capital at national scale, there is not much relevant, is not important. What was important in our case studies was this broad general related field of resources that are really linked to economic values. You have minerals, you have forests, biodiversity, because it's related to recreation, in particular in some African countries and in some countries in South of America. But the aesthetic dimensions was not captured in our case study. So I'm not able to answer your question properly. Sorry, Mark.
I'll have a go.
Mark is in fact Neil Windit, so he has been renamed. Probably the name of his computer. Sorry, Neil.
I think this is a great point. I really like it. I love the fact that you're saying, actually, you've got these professional conservationists, and they've got the things that they like. I talk at the Cambridge, I can't remember, the student conference every year, and I absolutely love it. But it is fascinating to see ecologists battle it out amongst each other. They're far more vicious than us economists. I don't know why we've got such a bad reputation about which species is more important. It's great fun. I think there is a problem. Biodiversity doesn't get its own voice. Instead, people do or do not take up that voice, and this can cause some real problems. So, for example, the biodiversity net gain legislation, which I think is a great idea, absolutely great idea, implemented just about as bad as you could possibly do it, so that the net effect may even end up being negative. And mainly because people have come in and said, right, biodiversity, we're going to capture it near to where the building sites actually are, and you end up maintaining poor quality areas and not actually doing what is best for biodiversity, which might be to take those funds and take it to the other side of the country and actually try and restore the sort of networks that wild species need to actually survive in this decimated country. Very difficult, I admit, to say how you're going to make decisions for biodiversity, but I think that's one example where you can see a failure to actually make decisions which benefit biodiversity in the best way possible.
It really got me thinking that question, because I was also thinking that sometimes it's an opportunity for change when you sort of manage to get the ear of someone influential, and you know, maybe they got a passion for the grey dagger or whatever its name was, and then they bring that in, and that starts something. It just can start to change a culture, but equally that's quite arbitrary, isn't it? And so
I mean, we do need to do something. You know, we can't wring our hands forever and say, "Oh, maybe there'll always be something better to do." So we have to make decisions. But I think trying to bring in as much information as quickly as possible, and that's what we're trying to do with these tools, so that you can at least have a pretty good feel for what the net effects of what you're proposing, and also very easily consider different alternatives. That's, I think, a way forward.
Yeah, counterfactuals or what-if experiments are so useful to do. Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to move now to a question from Sinead Sheridan at Nature Scott. And she has a question for you, Simone, about modes of implementation of natural capital within policy. So perhaps what I would call policy instruments. So she says, was natural capital embedded in policy through the policy development design stage? Or maybe you've got the comment open, you can read it. Did you have any comment on that? And I realised that obviously when we're doing this kind of review work, we're not always able to see all the detail which we might like.
Yeah, no, the question is relevant, is pertinent. Partially, I would say that the answer is embedded in the first part of your questions. Yes, the implementation follows of natural capital approaches or accounts, because in many cases we end up with exploring the natural capital accounts, is implemented through the policy cycle, following more or less the approach that Ian has explained before, but it's very difficult to find a specific policy that is implemented, I mean, the implementation, sorry, of a specific natural capital using the entire policy cycle. What we found is that in the countries in the global south are using accounts for monitoring policy or for setting a specific issues, problems, while there are many examples in the global north that use accounts and also a more advanced analysis, such as modeling and tools like the one that Ian showed, integration within ecological and economic models to formulate the policy response and implement the policy. But there was only one case study which was referring to the implementation of the energy policy in the Netherlands, that was considering the entire policy cycle, from the conception and a conceptualization of the policy until the review of the policy, using the natural capital approach, and in particular using natural capital accounts. While in the other cases, maybe just one phase, one moment only of the policy cycle was supported by the implementation of natural capital.
And maybe just a comment, not specific to natural capital, but generally in the sort of from the literature environmental policy integration, it's observed it's been easier to embed a commitment to it in high-level sweeping statements than it is to always express that in the allocation of resources or the design of specific policy instruments. So in that sense, I guess we're seeing that a little bit reflected in this when we focus on the natural capital as a means of getting this, making this happen. But we are starting to see perhaps a bit more progress than with other efforts. And what did we say earlier? Hand-wringing about, oh, we should do this better. So it is chipping away at it, I'd say, hopefully.
Cool.
I saw there obviously there's a bit of chat going on in the chat, which is what the chat's for. But there is also some questions. So from Helen Dunn, what do you see as the challenges to integrate other land uses into spatial models beyond agriculture and forestry? And maybe Ian, this one's for you.
Yeah. Lovely to hear from Helen. It's been a long time, and grand to get that question. Conceptually, I don't see these as problems that we can't tackle. There's no reason why you can't bring in particular, urban areas into decision making. The tools that we've got cover every inch of the UK, so it includes urban areas, but at the moment they're very crudely dealt with, and with the exception of, say, water and recreation, our own tools don't do very much beyond that. But there's no reason why we shouldn't. I think spatially explicit tools like this are the way to go. It flags up to decision makers the enormous benefits of thinking about doing things in different areas, you know, and in particular of taking the money that they've got available and targeting it to different areas. So this is a bit linked to recreation, but one area that we are working on is with regard to deprivation. So access to green space, that's pretty much in there already, and that shows that you can redistribute funding extremely efficiently. So that word that made you shiver, Kerry, by targeting it towards populations that at the moment have to endure pretty adverse environments. So yeah, there's no reason why you shouldn't be able to bring in other types of environment to this. Oh, and also the other, we have got the coastal zone included as well. So in particular, we're very interested in the potential that aquaculture has to try and produce high quality animal, if you like, protein with lower environmental impact. So yeah, we'll certainly make good progress on the coastal zone.
Well, it's not a comment about aquaculture, but thinking about that question from Helen reminded me of work happening with Nature Scott. So Anya Davison's got the tool she's been developing based on EcoServer about sort of landscape level decision making related to natural capital. So and that certainly would look just beyond agriculture and forestry, because up here we've got a lot of other non-agricultural land uses which tend to be more dominant. So there are possibilities and things happening.
Great.
Okay, so we're nearly coming to the end of our time. We're due to wrap up at 1:15, and I'm just scrolling back up the list to see what we've missed. Comments about badgers? Yes, we're burning down everything today, aren't we? Yeah, agree with that. Good thing we're not policymakers, because of course we couldn't be making any comments of such a controversial nature, especially not at the moment with PERDA. So Alex Waller has flagged that the UNEP apparently have some free online courses related to some of the concepts covered by Simone and Ian today. We've already covered about the tools that Ian mentioned, and you've responded in the chat saying that they're freely available on your website for the LEEP where you're based, and more coming soon. So I don't know if you wanted to add anything. There's a question on here we haven't addressed from Andrew Ross. Why is this information not embedded in the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures? So that's the TNFD. which connects directly with financial decision making. So this is the obligations for medium to large organizations to disclose their nature-related impacts and dependencies. That's the TNFD world. So the regulation of it, I guess, is in the control of the policymakers, but it then affects private sector organizations. I have to admit, I don't know precisely what are the categories of information that need to be reported under TNFD, and I don't know if either of the speakers do. So Andrew, I'm sorry, I think there are some things that would overlap between the kind of basic categories of concept, but I have to say I'm not sure we can answer that one in this talk. We'll have to bookmark that for another time.
Can I answer Alex's question?
Please.
Oh, now I've lost it. Oh, could there be a risk of over-reliance of these AI tools that may not account for future plant disease? Are there other downsides? Yes. I'm trying to make tools that make better decisions, not perfect decisions. But disease is one that I think we can do better than nothing. So we actually have got a little side project which was funded last year, looking at, I can't remember what the proper title of it is, but we now refer it to the 4 horsemen. So it's fire, wind, pest and disease. And what that is trying to do is to assemble the best or good information by which you could look at things like both agriculture and forestry over time, which the tools already do, but recognize that some of the risks are not constant. Now, I love that project, but it does flag up the fact that we really are, I'm not saying flying blind, but we haven't got a particularly good understanding of how both climate change but also trade is going to change things like pest and disease risk, especially when you're going out to 2050. And so really it's more a case of saying, well, if there's risk out there, how do investors deal with risk? You know, they're investing in things that could burn down or just disappear over the next 50 years. So how do they do it? And there is quite a lot of theory on this, which sort of says, well, what you need to do is to bring that uncertainty into the decision and to recognize that there's no point just looking at the mean outcomes, but also looking at the variance around it and how uncertainty might affect that, and to provide decision makers with options. For example, saying, right, you want to plant all these trees. If the risk from pest and disease doesn't change, this is probably the optimal thing to do. But if that isn't the case, then you might want to mix your, horrible word, portfolio, really using terms that a lot of people won't like, but I'm afraid this is how investors look at it, and try and create portfolios which are more resilient to those risks changing over time. There's no reason why we can't do that. There's no reason why you can't integrate it into the models. That's exactly what we're trying to do. But I would flag up that my understanding of the literature, which has certainly gone from 0 to, well, small over the last year, shows that there's a lot of risks we really don't understand. And we have to make decisions, so we're just going to have to use the information that's available.
I think on that slightly profound note, I think we better wrap it up there. But it brings me back to some of the basics, like the precautionary principle and stuff like that, which we've all been wrestling with, and I'm sure we're all told about when we started working in the environment. So lots of food for thought, but I'm just going to wrap it up by pointing out that there was a paper by Mays et al. In 2020 where they analysed the UK public sector, and they identified 85 UK public sector bodies that affect natural capital, 60s that depend on natural capital, and many of those are the same. And so I think there's plenty more to be done. And I'm noting Helen Dorrell's comment in the chat here about it's a hard task ahead, but we're decades past the sheep lookup quote from someone. So I think it's great that we're now starting to get tools, and the challenge is, to use the information we have, and to not to use the fear of the unknown and the uncertainties as a barrier to getting more action. And I think we've started to get into conversations that might be relevant for future NCI topics, or might relate to other research that's ongoing. So how we involve the private sector, how we deal with risk. So I encourage you to maybe look at the websites of the members of the NCI and follow up with Ian and Simone for particular things they've mentioned.